Okay, this is going to be a quick shading of the plastron, and you don't have to do too much. There are some general growth lines, but they're usually very faint, especially in some sliders, so I wouldn't worry too much. Just add a little bit here and there. Just some growth. The main thing that you're going to be shading is the area where the legs are, and this little area here where the shell actually the carapace is connected to the plastron, because there's a little bit of a bevel here in that area, and a little hint of a highlight there. And then the main thing is do a little bit here. I wouldn't worry too much about too much of the growth lines on the bottom of a plastron unless the individual turtle you see that you're working on actually has them, because a lot of them have a lot of markings that are probably going to cover this up, so you don't have to worry too much about it. Just keep it in mind. But the main parts that you're going to be shading are here, where the legs are. There's a bit of shadow underneath the marginals too. Not too much, but because they do have the same lighter color on the underside as the plastron itself does. But mainly it's going to be, the darkest areas are going to be around in the leg holes. And then they do have blotches around the sides, especially with sliders and their kin. That's part of the markings on the actual scutes. A lot of the pigmentation, that's what you're seeing in that. But mainly you're just going to worry about the leg holes for the most of the shading, the darkest shading, because there's pretty much a hollow there unless you're actually putting the legs in there. There's going to be some of the shadow around the legs too, but it won't be as intense as what we're doing here, just as an exercise for the shell itself. But that's generally all it takes to do the plastron, and I will be back with shading in the actual colors of the top of the carapace. Okay, I'm going to color in the carapace. I'm going to start with the darkest parts, which are the markings that I've already outlined. One of the things you can do to make it easier on yourself when you are coloring in a pattern on the carapace of a turtle shell is you can actually draw out the darkest parts, and that way you can kind of keep track on what you're doing and fill those pieces in first, and then go about, you know, making sure where your highlights are and your mid-range shading will be. So I'm going to start filling in the darker parts on the marginal scutes. And something I was bringing up before is between the scutes you can actually leave a tiny bit of white area between them, because actual turtles do have those lines in between their scutes. Sometimes it's a little more bright than others, depending on what their growth is like. Especially with juvenile turtles, you'll see a lot more defined space between the scutes because of all the growth that's happening. And even in some adult turtles you'll see it, but most of the time you'll see it in juvenile turtles, and mine, I'm using his shell as a reference, so he definitely has that. So I'm just going to kind of be using that same trait here as I color in my scutes. That's such a funny term, scutes. I don't know who named them that, but it's interesting. And with my yellow-bellied slider, he almost has a tiger striping pattern on his pleural and vertebral scutes. I actually have a photo of them that I can show toward the end of the video here so that you can kind of see what I'm talking about. But even though his colors aren't as flashy as some other turtles, they are still quite beautiful. I've found that with a lot of species is that it doesn't matter how colorful or not colorful they are, they all have their own kind of beauty to them. And even the most common turtles that are out there are, you know, still pretty admirable for their looks. And they do change as they age. When you've got hatchling turtles, their colors are extremely bright and well defined, and as the turtle ages, those patterns and colors will actually start to fade a bit or become blotchy. It's just something that happens with age. But yeah, anytime you see the hatchlings, they have the most intense colors. And then as they age, they lose that, unfortunately. Although there are some species that retain it into adulthood. I've seen some, I don't remember what species it was, but it's in the Pseudemis family, or genera, I'm not sure which group it is, but there was a keeper that had a group of them, and they had retained such a beautiful array of colors on their shells and their skin. And I think it was more to do with what he was feeding them that helped them retain that color. So that's another thing that's interesting about different types of reptiles. You'll see that a lot where they commercialize certain foods and market it for its color enhancing abilities. They do the same thing with fish foods. And it can have that effect. I mean, if you have got something in there that has properties that can enhance those colors through the diet, it definitely occurs with reptiles. I will say that I've seen it, and I used to keep fish too, so it's definitely something that works. But of course you have to be careful with what you feed, because you never know what's really in it. And then we'll get to the central scutes here. And remember with the vertebral scutes to leave a blank area for the spine, the keel where the spine is. You can actually shade it in just a little bit because of the darker areas, but just very slightly, just on the edge there. You might end up having to outline some of your scutes a little bit, because you're going to shade between them a bit anyway. You can just kind of outline them as you go along to kind of make sure that the lines are there. And then, of course, fill in the color between. And another thought too, and I know this probably won't come up very much, but occasionally turtles are born with extra scutes, or some that are kind of not where they're supposed to be. I've noticed this in certain turtles that are bred on farms and stuff like that. Sometimes they're born with imperfect scutes, like they're misshapen or they have too many. And it's not always the 5 vertebral scutes. Sometimes they'll have a bunch of little ones, scrunched in one area. I don't think that's a problem you'll encounter when drawing most turtles. But, if you're drawing an individual turtle like somebody's pet, or one that happens to have that sort of defect, that would be the only time I think you would encounter that. But that's just a thought for something that you might see in turtles. It's not very common, but it does happen. And there are also other shell deformities that you might see that aren't very common in wild populations, just because the wild populations tend to be a little healthier than the ones that are bred for the pet trade. But my own turtle, he has something called kyphosis, and it is what's known as a curvature of the back. It pretty much just looks like he's got a humpback, but it does not affect him at all. It's never affected his health. He would probably be fine in the wild, but I wouldn't ever put him in the wild anyway. It's not something that affects his health, as far as I know, and it's only a cosmetic sort of deformity, and I think it was more likely congenital, just something that happened in the egg for whatever reason. But he's perfectly fine otherwise, and he's a very sweet turtle. He likes to bite me, but I still think he's sweet. He's a very good eater. And I got him as a hatchling, and he was unbelievably small compared to what he is now. He's grown quite a lot. It's amazing how small they are when they're first born, and they grow up to these huge, anywhere from 8-inch long to almost a foot long, full-grown slider turtle. That's what some people don't realize, is they find these little baby turtles to be so cute, and then they don't realize how big they're going to get. So do your research if you want one. Make sure you can handle it. Okay, I'm going to start filling in the mid-range colors, or not colors, but shades on some of these scutes to kind of show you how that flows with the darker. I'm going to show you some of the growth lines on here just a little bit that are visible on my own turtle here. He's got a lot of little ripply effects on the sides, actually, more so than anything else. And you can't really see too much of the angular structure of the scutes when you're looking at him from above if he's in water. So I'm just kind of doing a little bit of this here. These are just called striations, or just lines. A striation is a fancy word for a line. But in general, it's just a little bit of that, and then you'll start to fill in a bit. Not too dark, not more darker than your darkest areas. And he did have a little bit of lighter color toward the middle of the scutes, because it's almost, again, like that tiger striping, and he's got the lighter color in between the dark. So you just do a bit of that. And then as you go along, just darken up toward the edges of the center of the scute here. Not center of the scute, but the edges there. And the outer rims, I would do that. And same process for any of the other plural scutes. Do your lines a little bit darker first, and then start shading in your mid-range shade. And leave a little bit of a highlight in there. This is a good way to exercise how to get your patterns down as well as the shading, because if you can do it with one pencil, you will be able to learn how to do it with several. This is just, kind of an exercise to help you understand how those shades work, the light and shadow of it all, and then eventually you can move on to using several colors in one piece. But just for this particular exercise, again, I'm reiterating that I wanted to make this a little bit simpler so it doesn't overwhelm everyone, just to get a feel for pattern and structure and texture, and then that way you can kind of get a better understanding of how these shells are built, how light plays off of them, the texture of the material on the scutes, the colors, and just kind of get a feel for everything and not, be overwhelmed. I will do a tutorial that goes over the color version of this. It's just wanted to start with something a little more simple at first so as not to overwhelm anyone. I'm trying to improve these tutorials as best I can. I want to offer, the best of my skills that I can without overwhelming people. So and again, the same thing, you'd go over with your growth lines here and the vertebral scutes, and then you shade in. There's not too much light area, the highlight in the vertebral scutes I've noticed on my turtle, but you can just shade in that color, that lighter pressure. And then shade in towards the center here, around the spine. And remember to leave the white area in between the scutes. And then do the same with the marginals, except with these guys, I would leave, there is a little bit of highlight around the edges of these, so I would leave that blank. Just work right up to the edge and then leave it blank. And you can actually leave a little bit of a tip there that's got some of the lighter highlight on it. Sometimes these will actually have highlights too, but they're not as noticeable as the larger scutes. And you're going to go outlining things as you go along, because if your outline is a little lighter like mine is, you might want to go back and straighten things up. Let's see, in here you could probably leave a little bit of a highlight. And these you can actually add a little bit of shading around the rim here where they meet the plural scutes. And those are the marginals done. actually going to add a little bit of light here. This is what happens when the sun starts setting. Okay, better. Now finish up these.